thank you all for being here today. It's a special occasion for the graduate thesis program and in general for the graduate program. Today we are hosting three phenomenal individuals that will be lecturing to all of you. In particular today, at this time, we are about to hear Marion Weiss lecture. As you know, Thesis has been changing in the past 5 or 6 years, and this year we decided to invite, instead of having only one person that would come from outside, to actually, the maturity of Thesis requires multiple people to come to the school and start to think about different tracks of ideas that somehow seem to be growing out of every single class every year. So we thought that this year was important to diversify and to help students to be in charge of their program and their projects and to have this contact with experts of the field. And in particular, this morning we've been listening to Axel Killian, who has been talking about technology and architecture. Now we're going to hear Marion Weiss talking about city and architecture. At 5, Joe Day, so I recommend you to actually make sure that you come as well, will lecture about diagrams. And the next meeting, which is going to be in a couple of weeks from now, will be Sylvia Levin talking about art. These 4 tracks have been something that have been going on actually in the graduate program at a wider scale. They started in fall with our local faculty, and then that will become a way to specialize the ideas of thesis of each single student. And Marion is, we're really honored to have her here. We never had a lecture at SCI-Arc, or not as far as I can remember. And I have to tell you a little thing. I was teaching at UPenn a couple of years ago, and I was going to the studio, and I saw a building which I liked, and I thought, oh, this building. It was the Center of Nanotechnology, and I realized that it's actually one of her design. She is a co-founder of Weiss Manfredi. It's an architectural firm based in New York. They really do much more than architecture, I think, and that's why she's been called to talk about architecture in a wider scale than maybe some of us are able to. The project spans from architecture to landscape to urbanism, and really she has a holistic way to understand what architecture means and what the scale of architecture can be applied to. And just, you know, she has an incredible curriculum, and I will mention only a few of the phenomenal prizes they won, but I think there is one that I think I like quite a bit, is the Olympic Sculpture Park, which I find this being an inspiring project, and clearly I'm not the only one, because the Time magazine considered this as one of the top 10 projects in the world, so I think not that many people can say that's what I've put on earth, you know, as an architect. They've been nominated by the Architectural League of New York, the Marion Voices. They won AIA Gold Medal Awards. They've been featured in many museums. The most important one, MoMA for sure, the Venice Biennale, the Cooper Union Museum. And just a few notes on Marion. She received a master's degree from Yale University, and she then went into teaching. She had many positions, among which one at Harvard University, Yale University, Cornell, and now she teaches, since 1991, so quite a bit. She has been faculty member at UPenn, and also she's visiting professor, the Saarinen Visiting Professorship, which is a quite important one, at Yale University. So I am honored that we can host you here, and we could actually become more familiar with the phenomenal projects that your firm has been developing in the past few years. Thank you.
Well, first I want to say a huge thank you, Elena, and for that great introduction that in many ways is daunting, because what you've illuminated here, I think, as a thesis program is something that takes the adventure of a question and considers what it might actually advance itself when it becomes architectural form. And architectural form is one thing, but the city as form giver or form receiver is something else altogether. And I opened with my partner, Michael Manfredi, our practice, Weiss Manfredi, in a sense with a huge disappointment that the ambition of the architectural project seemed so contained that it limited actually being able to have a broader impact and a broader set of engagements. And it seemed that the disciplinary boundaries of architecture, landscape, urbanism, and even ecological design seemed unnecessarily and administratively bifurcated to really no great synthetic production that could move things forward. And in fact, we had a kind of preoccupation with the city for a number of reasons. And in part, you know, at the time of our education, history was valued. History was something we studied. And when we started to think about Sixtus V's plan of Rome in 1585, which you see on the right, here was Sixtus V coming into a decrepit city of over 100,000 people scattered over its topographical variations. And he insisted on this kind of network of diagonals that would lead you not only to monuments, but through the infrastructural connection of water that was brought through very contemporary infrastructural terms freshly to fountains, which became the landmarks which connected. And then 200 years later, when you think about Specky's Spanish Steps, there was an occasion where the kind of topographical challenge of connectivity was either something that could be defeating and separating, or could be connective and so exaggerated in its scale of production that the kind of theater of connection could be something extraordinary, and you could say it became an inhabitable infrastructure that did so much more than just urban connection, but depended entirely on that network that was established nearly 200 years earlier. So this idea of synthesis, infrastructure, and networked occasions, in this case open-ended, a city that could actually lead you out and beyond, is in sharp contrast to the ideas of, say, fortification, which you see on the right with the kind of star fortified cities that had an enduring history that went on for a great, several hundred years. And when you think about the perfected form of the circle there, fortifications were designed to keep others, unlike those inside, outside. I find it startlingly resonant with the backdrop of what's happening today. So if in fact walls can be built to keep outsiders out, and they're not linear walls or systemic walls, but contained perfection, even temporal notions of contained round perfection are seen here on the left with Villa Piloto, which was temporary worker housing for the kinds of factories of extraction that were important in Brazil in the 1960s. And so this temporal occasion made everybody immediately near the center, and the periphery itself a kind of fortification. But if you start to think of ideas of interconnectedness and isolation, the circle and those things around it, with Ebenezer Howard and others, started to generate the idea of garden cities. And those kinds of histories, the kind of garden city on one hand of the cities of tomorrow, Ebenezer Howard, or Getty's Cities in Evolution, or Mumford's Cities in Development, the word cities is at the core, but the operative tomorrow, evolution, and development are the secondary words that become intriguing. We start to then think of this issue of perfection and cities, Villa Piloto being the temporal perfection. On the right, of course, a 5-month construction site, a fortification like no other, which is the Pentagon. Again, outside and inside become terribly important. But why this issue of fortification? Why this issue of inside is one thing and outside is another? And why is there this enduring ambition with, in this case, over 2 million square feet of Norman Foster in construction, I believe, in Cupertino, expected to open very soon? Would we have a corporate campus for IT, looking as if it captures nature, but keeps everybody out? Again, this notion of invention. What is a city? And if you think about the largest infrastructural invention of a landform of a city, the Palm Islands, this one being the first one that's built, and this is now only a few years old, could ultimately be a city of leisure right off the edges of Dubai. So again, the form is important, but in fact the thing that's been our preoccupation is the connective tissue. And the connective tissue, if it's natural or man-made, becomes an operative force that we are always in opposition. If you look at Thomas Cole's The Oxbow of 1836, it shows the kind of wandering rule set that water can make in its own course, and yet you see it in this truly picturesque setting that is very, very large. Roethra's Junction, Atlanta, one of my favorite, incredible artworks, is indeed looking down at the artwork of infrastructure, which is so profound in the amount of physical energy embodied in concrete to bypass the very place that it exists to do this monofunctional thing to connect at great distances. So some preoccupations that have sort of been on our minds have to do with architects who are truly quirky and strange, and in this case Plečnik in Ljubljana, who was preoccupied with the form of water in the city and the obligation to actually connect and fortify in the same breath. And his triple bridges here in 1932 is this astonishingly beautiful excess, and he was kind of a Gaudi-esque character in his own way, where there could have been just one bridge with pedestrian passages on either side, but instead he has the central bridge for traffic and two pedestrian bridges on either side, becoming a landmark of infrastructural destination and iconicity for the city. And then he also worked on the fortifications of the walls. These banks flooded, they became problematic. So you can see now this notion of architecture and fortification operate a little further down the river. But less known and far more interesting to us has to do with this idea that as it pulled itself out of the city and was dealing with flooding, it became a stepped, relaxed fortification so that when it was flooded, it would go up to the upper level. But in the summertime, when it was dry, it would create multiple promenades and levels so that when the city was most attracted to stroll in, there was a multi-leveled promenade created by the absence of water. So Plečnik really understood the operation of an inhabitable infrastructure. You know, not so far off in the 30s and 40s with Le Corbusier's fantasies for this inhabitable infrastructure here, the project for road building in Rio de Janeiro, and then the Plano Bus for Algiers, where the notion of movement and inhabitation might simultaneously coincide and sort of one-up each other in those ideas. And in fact, right near a block and a half from where I live, in Brooklyn, there is this fantastic story where Robert Moses was going to charge through this historic little neighborhood with the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and there was a huge outcry. And so there was the invention that had never been seen, and here it is in 1950, of leveraging the sectional topography of the 70-foot grade change of the city to the water's edge to create 2 lanes of traffic and a pedestrian outcome above. And you can see this inhabitable infrastructure that is truly extraordinary. That led to many other fantasies even later on, and the Ford Foundation, obviously all about cars, funded a fantastic study that Paul Rudolph came up with a kind of expressway or freeway that could cut through Manhattan and yet again still produce housing in the very streets where housing could never exist. This whole idea, though, was fully realized, inspired by the realization of the GW Bridge as it cut through, tore down city blocks to continue across the island, and in that motion produced the most incredible, incomplete, utopian product that I've ever seen, which is the Nervi bus station, the high bridge towers that spanned across the cut and then moved across the water. And that sort of incomplete utopia said that somehow all at once these things might exist. And Nervi actually, it's the first time they brought this incredible Italian architect to produce this remarkable form. But again, the kind of Cheongga-chin, though, is yet another thing in Korea where the idea of a highway that divided was torn down to reveal a park and 27 bridges that could connect, and then reintroduced an ecology of a lost river that had been overcome by the freeway and returned. So these ideas then of life that could be added to these infrastructures then become very much at stake when you think about Hurricane Sandy in New York, where you can see Iwan Bond's fabulous photo, where the blackout of the city actually was caused and very few generators allowed some lights to exist. And this notion of our vulnerability when we're at the water's edge was true and real and impactful, which then led to some of our own fantasies about this kind of sectional, elevated infrastructure that might in fact offer greater life than just roads and traffic, but allow us interstitial layers to inhabit. So all these preoccupations we organized about a year ago and produced a book called Public Nature's Evolutionary Infrastructures. And our thought was that there were really a couple of things that we were preoccupied, and one was the notion of things that actually affected the structuring of public space in the city, and the other was the social infrastructures that actually create a scaling of place that then might reach out and have more territorial engagement. And so what I thought I would do is just share some images here of a small snapshot of projects that are both urban in nature, but actually take the thesis from material expression back into a territory that hopefully engages the city. Barnard College, right across from Columbia University, a women's college, only 4 acres, quite a comparison to Columbia's neighbor, but very much like Columbia, surrounded by walls, and those walls marked by gates and in fact the Women's Campus Center, because it's a women's college marked by concrete. They wanted to do a creative arts center, and so we actually said, let's find out what's behind the wall, which were 2 layers of landscapes 20 feet apart. And we said if we need 100,000 square feet of building, then somehow we might connect 2 divided landscapes, but also create interior topographies that might carve through architectural forms to bring sectional connections that in this case involved tearing down the bowling alley, which was a social center for the school a while back, and turn it into now a topography that connected divided landscapes, and take the kind of crosswalks of a campus into crosswalks on the side of the building that then might actually reveal inside the kind of connective tissue that creates a social infrastructure of engagement, so that everybody in the architecture studios that are on top are looking down to the cafe and reading rooms below. And this notion of specular use that we normally say are hidden through section are actually utilized in spaces that could be interconnected and woven through movement. And then ultimately that expression of movement and engagement is something that's inscribed and sort of projected from the surface of the building, but that surface wanted to actually have the indefinite character of the brick campus through a new medium here with externally acid-etched terracotta color chromatically infused glass that actually might correlate with the bricks and actually offer some kind of compatibility that ultimately, as it joins the kind of family of brick campus buildings with its own stature, actually has some capacity to transform what is a wall into something that is really an illuminating reflection of the section of engagement inside the Diana Center. So that first question of sort of this, is it part of the city or is it independent, becomes all the more confusing when we start to think about the idea of landscape and city. And with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, we had this very interesting question of a 52-acre garden that's embedded within the city, but has always had some very, very strange relationship where the city is looking like one thing above and the gardens look like something entirely other on the other end. And so our question was, could we take the gateway, which looks like this on Mother's Day, 42,000 people in one day visit the garden, and actually create something that might literally fuse like origami, the city and the garden together, so that you arrive in the city and somehow over a 440-foot grade change through an inhabitable topography find yourself moving from the city and leaving it behind through a kind of sectionally modulated gradient that actually is part architecture, part building, part infrastructure. So that that kind of wandering guise of trellis light through the acid-etched glass above, or the radial conditions that are marked around the tree drip line that we had to watch out for, this very fantastic tree. And then the kind of flat iron effect of choosing the city to the left or the garden to the right, or the visitor center inside with its own orientation, or finally the only two-sided room in Manhattan that seats 160, is really this idea of this transference of what it means to actually host and inhabit an edge of a path, to inhabiting a landscape, to in fact actually embodying the whole idea of movement above and through, so that the upper level of the bankment of the garden is something that allows you to simultaneously see garden and architecture. And in fact, sometimes the architecture disappears because it's a high operation green roof that actually has 44,000 different plants that change over time, that have seasonal capacity to become invisible in the park, that actually hosts new life, problematically so, but in fact could be almost something that disappears when seen from the Japanese garden, so that the architecture itself is far less important than the garden it produces, but it ultimately is this tethering line between city and garden. Now, again, we enter a lot of competitions because competitions ask bigger questions. And the Sylvan Theater competition, which we were fortunate to win on the National Mall in Washington, took the idea of this outdoor theater, which is the only outdoor public venue in Washington. The rest are monuments or indoor memorials or Smithsonian institutions. But it's really on the sleeve or the corner or the edge of the Washington Monument, 400 feet away. A kind of a sad remnant, rebuilt in the 70s, even though it was visualized in 1917, as this plywood affair, and you could see where it's located with the bathrooms in the back, the tour buses behind that, and everybody was looking from the dome of the monument terrain to that backdrop. And they wanted to re-envision it and make it better. And our point was that, in fact, if you made it better, you'd still have right behind you the buses. But if we could think about it further, we could actually say that maybe it takes monumental Washington and even the beauty of the tidal basin and simultaneously create a new theater, but also create new connections to landscapes that have been divided permanently by roadways. And so taking the notion of Sylvan, which had been her goal, to make it truly Sylvan with a grove of trees inspired by things like the Swarthmore Amphitheater, we did the most important thing, I think, was to question the existing Sylvan Theater's orientation and suggest that the backdrop should always be the Washington Monument, not the buses, and that if we could reorient that, we could actually lift the land, and through that lifting the land, house all and conceal everything that was not so great to look at, like visitor services and the restaurants, et cetera, underneath an earthen berm, and that by the time we get at the top of the earthen berm of this amphitheater, we'd be clearing 26 feet over the freeway so that we could actually wander over to the tidal basin and simultaneously slip down and stay within the required height that could not exceed the base of the monument. Now again, you could start to see the mapping of it, but the whole point was it to be incredibly impactful and barely visible. And that's a tall task. This is the kind of cutaway of what the site looks like right now. You can see the thin wall, the tour buses. And then this is showing how the operative section actually allows us to have groups as small as 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people with this three-sided theater notion all at once in the pavilion for the kind of first food service, if you will, on the mall will be just beyond. And that lifting of the kind of dining pavilion is something that, again, can only cap out to the top of the mall. But the idea here really was to say, as barely there as possible could be the invitation potentially for some magic. Okay, it's not quite a smooth animation, but again, the next question really for us got to questions of how to take very hidden things in institutions and universities, in this case, University of Pennsylvania, and take the Nanotechnology Building and try to make an urban statement for the most hidden yet shared service of an invisible science being forged there. Now, the interesting thing for us is that as we started digging into nanotechnology and got ourselves lost in that kind of world of research, we started looking very hard at the city of Philadelphia and West Philadelphia, where the university is, and noticed that the one thing that they all shared in terms of identity were a series of green spaces. You can see the 5 in downtown Philadelphia, but you could also see the network of green spaces that happened only after the fact at University of Pennsylvania through the demapping of roads. The claiming of institutionality through landscape occurred bit by bit. So that was interesting when we looked at the engineering area, because there was no landscape to be seen in this particular area, not one of the most compelling parts of the university, but closest to the city itself. And so what we started to look at was this question was, well, the whole engineering area had no green. And so surgically, again, just like the removal of roads, we started to question that and wondered if we could actually create a lab building that could leverage the adjacency of an existing one and actually offer the lack of efficiency or generosity of open space and still the efficacy of a lab, which is primarily boxes. And if you look at the upper diagrams as they unfold, we actually had to keep most of the boxes of those labs in the back of the site because it's the most vibration-free and electromagnetically free. They were very site-specific in terms of those labs, but others could strand to the city. But the only thing that didn't have vibration criteria that was controlling of the actual research work was the place of gathering. And so while the programmer Reese said that there'd be a gathering space on the main floor was the most important space to locate these vibration-free things. So we actually moved up to 40 feet, the place of gathering. Now that's a weird thing because we wanted to also produce a large green. And so by elevating it, making it column-free, the 68-foot cantilever does a lot of work. And you can start to see the operations of unfolding, but engineering that unfolding so that it could reveal, in fact, a green. And so you can start to see here, there was also a great uncovering. This is Tony Smith's piece, I Lost, which was found in storage by the Dean of Engineering, Eduardo Glant, who was our most visionary client. And so that became the kind of icon, if you will, of the gateway. But what became more iconic for us is how do you reveal this hidden science? We visited all these nanotechnology facilities. Almost all of them are in the basement because the earth mass actually is the most vibration controlling. And they could also have no natural light in there. They all had little orange portals to look in. And we said, well, what's up with the orange portals? And they said they blocked out the UV rays, which they couldn't let in the light. And we said, well, what if we made orange portals into a whole wall and had no barriers? Could we do it? And nobody could say no, because it actually could be done. So this is the first and one and only amber wall that reveals all of the nanotech research that's going on in the clean room. And then in those areas where natural light could come in, we pulled into the basement spaces natural light, where the most vibration sensitive but not light sensitive work was going on. But because lab buildings have a 20-foot floor to floor, which is truly huge, and the elevators had to be the far extremes of the building because of their electromagnetic interference, we had to, according to the Dean of Engineering, who's from Buenos Aires, he said, you must make the most delicious stair for everybody to go up. So, of course, that was a pretty interesting query, because every landing then became an opportunity for collaboration in our mind, because we had so little footprint for social space that we had to grab every sectional opportunity to do so. But we also wanted people to be within eyesight of each other, and the whole notion of peripheral vision to the idea of creating a community is almost a truly urban idea, which is, by being part of something larger, you in fact can engage something beyond yourself. At the very top is the forum space, which seats about 120, and at the very, very edge, some chairs we designed with Vitra lookout, which is kind of a wingback chair. You start to see everything scaled into a kind of intimate cocoon of wood, and that leads to a green roof here, which actually is part of the water detention collection system. And it does a tremendous amount of work. Stormwater management in Philadelphia is a huge job. And then you could also see that the issue of the surfaces of these things became interesting, and we actually folded where we had to have opacity, folded metal that could catch light, but we used an externally acid-etched patterned glass that was fritted on both sides to be able to create this illusory presence of transparency that would actually amplify the sense of it being not just a glassy building, but something that was other. And so ultimately it really is an idea about a place of research for the most hidden, invisible kind of science becoming a protagonist with this larger urban and institutional setting. And so this idea of becoming a protagonist in an urban setting actually took off most recently, and this just opened in October, at Kent. And some of you might know the Kent State shootings. That's probably what they're more noted for, and reluctantly so. But they were also trying to connect to the city, and they held a competition to say, we need to do an architecture building that connects to our newly realized downtown that we are collaboratively doing between the city and the university. The whole thing being a strange invention of kind of funny colored bricks of a variety of patterns, connecting to the university, which is a really rich collection of limestone and also these kind of warm amber toned stones. And so our feeling was that somehow the landscape too was a larger connective tissue, and that we couldn't leave any of these things behind, but actually had to truly forge these connections and actually have the building do a tremendous amount of work on this site. They built an esplanade in true postmodern illumination. But we said if we actually followed that esplanade, we would have only had a head-on relationship to the campus and to the city. But if we could take that program, if you will, and tip it slightly, we'd be able to reveal more to the city about what's happening within the world of architecture inside. And so the operations of actually stepping down to the academy to be the height of those buildings and reaching up to the city to be the height of those buildings, and to open up these studios themselves as these lenses that might actually ultimately connect and reveal what's going on inside, in many ways took some of the clues that we explored in the Barnard building and even the Nanotech building, which was creating something that might begin gravity bound and finally ascend and release itself off the site. Now, what became very interesting is it's a super simple building. And it means that everybody can be within eyesight of each other. Very simple studio section. But what became quite interesting for us was the material of cladding that section, which we then discovered that the Belden Brick Company, with their beehive kiln, which is an ancient technique which fires these iron spot bricks, could produce 7 different colors through one clay, depending on where they located it within the kiln. And so all these different color iron spot bricks then begin to add something that's not so much monolithic, but somehow richer. And we had them do a custom brick that could cantilever 4 inches without any kind of steel reinforcing. That was the maximum dimension, so that we could start to get some tactility that would be expressive and accessible for a building of this super scale. And so this is this girl who was, just when it opened, was kind of rubbing her hand as she walked along the sidewalk because it's an asymmetrical fin. But it really does add, even at nighttime, a kind of texture that is a huge contrast between the luminous boxes of the studio, and in this case, the studio facade, if you will, in glass, is that which faces the university, and if you look up inside, you see that whole escalating transparency. And there it is, the studio. Kent doesn't have computers yet. They may soon. But hopefully this building will invite a sense of engagement, and you can see the studio critique spaces there, the glass boxes, so that everybody is always being seen while they're being critiqued, but everybody's always within eyesight while they're working too, and there's a cafe space on the lower level. But really it's this idea that you could totally elevate this question of what it means to have a studio environment that's part of the city and transforms the city, a library here that has a materials library on the 2nd floor, offices above, but ultimately in some cases within the town it totally disappears. And within the landscape it kind of reappears as part of that connective landscape. So Cornell Tech, Roosevelt Island, strange city. We participated in a competition, and in fact we're in the thick of now experiencing what it means, because we're almost done with construction. It'll be done in the fall. But it's a strange island that has always been a place of fantasy, and you recognize Rem Koolhaas here, but in fact it's an island that's just as vulnerable to being underwater as any other part of New York City. And so we started to think about both its panoramic capacity to have water on 2 sides, and then Cornell Tech trying to create a kind of hybrid campus that embraces the entrepreneurial world of tech on one side, and then the whole idea of directed research on the other. And so there was a master plan that was done by SOM, field operations doing the landscape, but they gave us this very weird site, big, boxy, and a barrier. And our first thought was, oh my God, you know, it's just dividing the island in half. So what if we could actually cut that site in half and offer river-to-river views and create 2 crystalline perimeters that would have everybody joining at that hourglass place, so the desire to have the entrepreneurs and the academics connecting could be made possible through this whole idea of illumination and connection. And so you can start to see the plan. Tom Main's building is on the left there. We've had a lot of fun kind of working and overlapping together. Our buildings are going to open at the same time. But you could see this whole idea that we're actually using the landscape to carve through the building and grab and leverage things like the section of that landscape and pull it up, elevate it on a plinth because of the water levels. Again, you can see Tom's building there close to us and our building in the back with the green roof. But the idea then is to use the cantilever again and the trusses to clear up and free up the landscape and double up the landscape while doubling up the interior space. And inside, the topography of that landscape by field operation makes its way inside the building and takes you up to a piano nobile, which is the entry of the Cornell Tech space. But the idea, again, we learned from the Nanotechnology Building that if we're going to have a grand stair, it better be a place that you can spend time on, and there are only so many amphitheater stairs you can do where you actually still need to furnish it. So we actually have these robust intermediate landings that actually have a whole lot of places to plug in. It's under construction. It's further along than this, but you can start to see, though, what's extraordinary is the views that it offers out. And in fact, you can start to see that it does really operate as constructing islands within the island and vistas across the water. And again, this whole idea that I mentioned before of keeping at stake, even at a very fundamental and simple level, elevating yourself from the water level and the flood line, could inform these kinds of connections that I just described earlier to ultimately create something that collaborates as a university with the buildings and the landscape around. Now, just within eyesight of the building, if you just look behind the screen, we're working on Hunters Point South Park, and it's a park that's completed phase 1, which is a post-industrial site where they're actually trying to do the largest affordable housing since 1970. And so in this case, it's the idea of creating first something that could be resilient and robust, these are Hurricane Sandy images again, but become a new destination or an infrastructure that is truly green, ties into the city with what we call smart streets, and takes this strange irregular perimeter and actually recognize part is hard and part is soft, and that could actually receive, catch and release, if you will, and catch the water and let it go, but create a kind of armature of destinations that even reach out. You can see the cantilever. This is phase 2 under construction now. I'll show you phase 1 completed, where we could actually take advantage that it is the highest point, believe it or not, in all of this whole area across the river, to look out, and then also allow that kind of soft edge to look in. These are the kind of drawings are both concrete, but this whole gravitational arc of steel is one where you can see the pavilion that hybridizes every functional need from cafe, pavilion, restrooms, park rangers. Here it is in the kind of submergent stage or the winter stage. But here it is right now where it truly organizes a central green, and that then all the kind of high-intensity play areas come down over here, and working with Thomas Balsley and Arup, you can see this rail garden landscape that looks out. And in this case, it's been a wonderful way to both bring the community back in, resurrect a beach that was lost, create a playing field which is completely artificial with a crescent of green which is totally natural, so that people like Bernie Sanders can actually have an event or a rally that can host a large gathering, or something as minimal as a pickup softball game. It's right across from a school, so they use it heavily. But the pavilion itself is hardworking. It collects all the water for the park, and because of its back cant, collects all the energy to light the park with the solar panels. But it also provides the shade for the water taxi. So this issue of simultaneity is really what's truly at stake here. And ultimately, it's a place of connection and a place of prospect, so that while it's finite, it borrows a tremendous amount of the city beyond. So the last project I'll share is the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle that Elena mentioned, and for us it was a fantastic competition to win because we couldn't think of a better client, a museum shaping a piece of the city on the waterfront. And in fact, it was an amazing thing. It found out that this kind of waterfront site had actually been hosed down through this kind of fabulous thing by this developer, Denny, who basically wanted to create land. And what you see here that's so amazing is that anybody who wouldn't sell their home, he hosed around until it became challenging and problematic for them to keep their homes. That's what I call developer without an environmental twist, but amazing. And so it produced this land. Everything from that middle road there is all new towards the water's edge. But when the museum held the competition, they were a little coy about it. It was actually 3 separate sites: a contaminated Union Oil of California former site, a highway that was a federal high-bodied, wide-bodied truck route, another site that was slender, then the train lines, and then a tiny little slender waterfront site and a crumbling seawall that the Army Corps of Engineers said would take about $70 million to repair. But they wanted to create a park all through the lens of art, said if they had enough money, maybe they could cover up the infrastructure. And our thought was that the infrastructure, what was cool about it, and that if we could somehow unfold some kind of landscape that might wander from the city to the water's edge, you might actually be able to have both the infrastructure and the inhabitation be magical because of each other. And so you can start to see this is the site as it was, and this is the design as it became. And it really was a super simple move that through its topographic change could create all these different environments. But it was the issue of simultaneity, so that even with the failing seawall, we managed to get federal funds to create habitat and reinforce through this kind of revetment and series of benches the seawall. Cost us $5 million to do it. Army Corps said it would take $70 million. So, but you can see this whole idea of these arrows look straight to the city, look straight to the port, go down to the beach, and somehow have a Kunsthal in the middle of it. But all these kind of systems need to be thought of all at once. And by the way, because it was formerly contaminated, we had to create these kind of contamination wells for monitoring. But as a landscape for art, And it's a landform that actually has these serial sections that through 365,000 cubic yards of earth brought from 11 blocks from an excavation site nearby, we actually shaped a topography that could clear 20 feet at the highway and 23'6" at the train lines, and actually use highway construction with what's called MSE, or mechanically stabilized earth, to build up a false topography that would be highly stable then with precast walls here that would go up another 42 inches to be like a guardrail. The precast walls are fabulous because it's a seismic zone, and their overlap can allow them to move 4 or 5 inches with having no damage whatsoever in a seismic event. And so even that trope makes it all the way into the building. And what you'll see if you look closely is at the edge of the overlap, we did a high sandblast to abrade the surface so that if indeed there is seismic activity, it's pre-abraded. So look closely at that. You can see the two different colors there. But it was called the Olympic Sculpture Park because the donors felt that it was the Olympic mountains beyond that were far more important than the names. And the Calder Eagle was the only work of art that they owned at the time that they did the competition. But what you can start to see is that all these topographies became an opportunity for us to have a super simple, Z-shaped, totally groomed lawn of a landscape, and to have meadows that would change and be green or dry and actually show the temporal characteristics. And then you can start to see things like the valley with the evergreen trees holding Richard Serra's Core 10 piece in the wake, or all the way down to the edge you can see the beach. So these are just some before and after images here. This is the pavilion itself, 67 cars below, and a kind of Kunsthalle above, and a portal or a gateway for the kind of bridge crossing, Roxy Payne's tree, and a kind of specular folding of the metal that allows the city, even as cars drive by, to become part of that sort of expression of the site at night. And then a mirror star glass, which is part clear, part mirror, that faces the city side. And inside, the idea was that changing artists and younger artists would have a chance to be using this space. This is now from the mezzanine level looking down at the cafe and looking out. Super tough, simple structure that could hang and hold almost anything. And then you could see here the work by Pedro Reyes on the mural and his suspended cupolas that you can inhabit. They're hanging. I don't know what anybody's liability concerns are with inhabitable artwork, but it did fine. And you can start to see that this now frames views out to the port. Again, that kind of folded stainless steel wall allows you to look into a slot window only 6 feet high. But again, you can start to see our thinking here, and this is a drawing that we were working on to actually organize topography to frame space so that you could get away from the roadways and be captive within a valley, so that Richard Serra's piece here could be an amazing thing that people might bow down to through the act of yoga in the morning. And you could start to see that those terraces that cover the parking garage that extends all the way forward also becomes and produces this amphitheater that simultaneously connects to the valley. And all these armatures then are operating in section, so that even as we traverse and cross that highway, that single little point is something that you can start to see, so that that point allows you to simultaneously in a car experience it as well as a pedestrian experience it. And so this is the actual point. That point in concrete is the dead center of the trucking route. And the idea here was to not give you a shortcut across the sites, but to, like a golf course, elongate and stretch out and make as long as possible a journey across 9 acres. And actually, even as you're going through that point and you're driving through, we'd like to get a little kind of trip switch so anybody who drives here can be counted as a visitor of the sculpture park. But that really is saying that anybody who's even on a train going up to Canada could experience this bridge. And we worked with artist Teresita Fernandez. She did the glass piece called Cloud Cover, which meets the obligation of a throw fence, which needs to go up and across over the train tracks. And in this case, you can see that we actually then got a cantilever for the train spotters. But her work actually does these remarkable things which casts light on the infrastructural wall, so that now there's a toggling oscillation between the art and the infrastructure. And so the art and the infrastructure, if you will, even working with Mark Don on the lower left to make a corner piece, or Richard Serra, or Tony Smith again with the Stinger, or Calder, who had created the Eagle before, could actually allow this journey of art, in this case Richard Serra's wake being assembled, being driven from Long Island City on 10 trucks to the site. You can see him here. Or the Mark Dion piece here, which holds the city corner with a rotting nurse log, 70 feet long, hosting under this green glass the artificial nature of a fallen tree in a forest right in the heart of the city. But for us, what became most interesting was transforming the single least accessible part of the city, which was the waterfront divided by train tracks and highways, and actually starting to envision it as something that was truly accessible and part of that landscape, if you will, that would allow you to look back to the city or across to the water, or in fact actually have the kind of logs that wash up for the logging industry that create the most amazing beaches, and here we actually work to pull land away to create a beach and salmon habitat. That could also even get us to the tidelands below and work with the kind of two aquatic specialists that we worked with that actually created a pocket beach to create basically a place for juvenile salmon that apparently like to hang out in a certain sort of setting. We learned a lot about it. But you can start to see that ultimately these subtidal to urban tides to the kind of armature of this landform ultimately is very, very small, but systemically ambitious in its connections to something quite a bit larger. So I'll close with this slide to actually talk about, I guess, the ambition that you all have now with Thesis, which is to take somehow in something very, very precise, larger ambitions. So thank you.